Ornn is perhaps one of the most underrated champions in terms of the impact that he can have on his team regardless of how well he's doing. Ornn brings a new mechanics to the game that no other champion has access to, and continues to leave most players confused how Ornn seems to win even when underperforming. Like many players will agree, Ornn is essentially the pinnacle of an all-rounder champion. Ornn, the fire below the mountain, was added to this champion arsenal a little over 5 years ago and has seen few changes since release. In this video, you'll see exactly how you can use this champion to be the bane of your enemy's existence. Before we get into the video, here's a quick rundown. First, we'll cover Ornn's champion identity and where he fits among his counterparts in the top lane. Then we'll review his abilities, optimal runes and builds, best combos and helpful tips, lane matchups, ideal synergies, and general playstyle in each stage of the game. If you haven't already, please make sure to subscribe for more content like this. Let's start with champion identity. Ornn's design is simple in principle, but quite complicated when used optimally. The simplest way to describe it is to look at his win rate by champion mastery. Looking at his win rate by number of games played, Ornn's win rate skyrockets the more games you play, up to around 60 games, but doesn't really start that low either. Essentially, it shows that only a handful of games invested will give you the comfortability to optimally play the champion, but it doesn't mean he's difficult to play with to begin with. In order to play Ornn well, you do not need an immense mechanical prowess. Having that little bit of execution can make the world of a difference in finding a lead in lane though. We will dive a little bit deeper into this in the combos and helpful tips section, but his kit is more intricate than you might think. One thing's for sure, and that's you need to know how to take advantage of what Ornn has to offer for his team to ensure you have the most consistent results to climb in solo queue. This means understanding the best order to upgrade mythic items, and especially the right situational items for each unique game. Overall, Ornn is a fantastic and consistent champion that will work wonders in solo queue if you invest a dozen or so games to get a good feel for his purpose in the team and his lane matchups. Ornn's versatility and true all-rounder playstyle makes for an incredible addition to your arsenal. Let's move on to his abilities. Starting with his passive being Living Forge, Ornn actually gains additional armor and magic resistance from all sources. Ornn can also spend gold to forge non-consumable items when away from base as well, so he's got that Amazon Prime shipping. Additionally, Ornn can also upgrade mythic items of his teammates and himself later on in the game to masterwork items for additional stats. Moving on to his Q, Volcanic Rupture. In this case, Ornn fires a skill shot dealing magic damage and slowing enemies. After a slight delay, a pillar actually forms at the end location of this skill shot. Now onto his W, Bellow's Breath. Ornn moves forward, breathing fire in a cone. All enemies hit by the final tick become brittle. Brittled enemies will take a portion of their maximum health as bonus damage, and immobilizing effects will last longer when used on brittled enemies. As Ornn, a basic attack on a brittled enemy will knock them back. Ornn's E is Searing Charge. Ornn dashes forward, dealing damage to enemies he makes contact with. If Ornn collides with terrain while charging, a radius around him is hit with a shockwave that knocks up all enemies caught and deals bonus damage. Finally, the ultimate, Call of the Forge God. Ornn summons a ram-like skill shot that travels towards him. Enemies hit take damage, are slowed, and brittled. When recast, Ornn charges into the ram and redirects it in the direction he hits it, causing the ram to charge again in that direction and knock up enemies, dealing additional damage and reapplying brittle. Now onto his runes and items. While there are some differences in rune choices for professional play, for the sake of simplicity, the main rune option is Grasp of the Undying in the Resolve tree for Ornn. Under Resolve, you'll also want to take Demolish, Second Wind and Conditioning, and Overgrowth. Grasp of the Undying provides tremendous value to Ornn when trading in lane, because he can extend the duration of the trade to take advantage of this rune twice and massively outtrade most opponents. Demolish is a fantastic pairing with Ornn's laning dominance because he can stay in lane forging items for so long that he can force enemies out of lane and essentially pick up free turret plating. The main decision is between Second Wind and Conditioning. Second Wind is better when the enemies try to make shorter trades around their ability cooldowns to minimize damage taken. Alternatively, Conditioning helps Ornn become an absolute monster of a tank by providing additional resistances for the mid game. Finally, Overgrowth is relatively optimal to stack up on more health throughout the laning phase and become a beast by the mid game. To pair with this Resolve setup, taking Magical Footwear and Biscuit Delivery provide more value with a free boost of speed and added sustain to regress through the early game unchallenged, so you can remain in lane to get those demolished plates. Finally, for the offensive, defensive, and flex rune options, you'll want to take attack speed and then armor or magic resistances depending on the lane matchup. Ornn mainly has two mythic items to choose from, and these are Frostfire Gauntlet and Sunfire Aegis, which predominantly depends on whether you want to deal slightly more damage and have tenacity, or provide more utility with a slow and have more health. If you're looking for the tenacity, then Sunfire Aegis is your option, and Frostfire Gauntlet is best for the slow. The best boost will be dependent again on the matchup and the overall enemy team composition. If you find yourself against like Renekton top, Lee Sin jungle, and Yone mid, plated steel caps will obviously work wonders. Otherwise, you'll want to consider Mercury Treads or boosted swiftness for some added slow resistances. Depending on the situation, the next best item will be one of a handful of options, which is what makes Ornn complex in his own way. Ornn can build pretty much any item given the right context, to be honest with you. You could be looking at stacking up more armor with items like Thornmail, Frozen Heart, and then finishing off the build with Mormogs and Gargoyle Storm Plate, for example. There are many options with Ornn, so it's important to really think about the enemy sources of damage and the main problems you need to overcome. Again, despite Ornn's relatively simple ability design, there's some complex intricacies that can separate the good from the great. Let's start with some of the basics that are crucial to Ornn. First is QWE to skip the E animation to make it very difficult to dodge. For Ornn's full damage combo, you actually want to use Q to R1, then using E for the knockup, using an auto with Brittle, hitting R2, proccing Brittle again, and then using W, and then proccing Brittle one more time. So basically, this will proc Brittle 3 separate times for some insane damage. For a faster engage that's nearly impossible to dodge, consider using R1, and then right as R1 travels through the enemy to apply Brittle, you can flash towards them to use R2. When trading in lane especially, you'll want to finish off with your W and start walking away so you can use basic attack to proc Brittle. The enemy will be knocked back, and it will be even more difficult for them to pursue to continue the trade. Ornn has a lot of great matchups and a lot of bad matchups actually. And fortunately for Ornn though, his worst matchups are pretty uncommon champions, whereas his good matchups are quite common, especially in solo queue. In general, Ornn suffers against champions that can counter his gap closure or crowd control with their own abilities, as Ornn uses 2 dashes that are critical to his kit. A great example of this is Singe, who can use Mega Adhesive to prevent Ornn from using R2 and from using his E. Another great example is Poppy, who can block him from using the dashes in the same way, or even Mordekaiser, who can ult Ornn to prevent his ultimate from getting massive value on a cluster of enemies. Fiora can also use her passive and riposte to maneuver trades very well around Ornn, which gives him a lot of problems on that front. Ornn works much better against attack damage boosters in the top lane like Renekton, Gnar, Jace, Quinn, and Yorick to name a few. All of these champions have little to no way to deal with Ornn in the late game without getting an insane amount of attention from the jungler to camp the lane and put Ornn behind. Touching on jungle pairings. While Ornn does pair well with most junglers because he brings so much to the table, the best pairing is a more carry-oriented champion that can use his gank setup to snowball enemies. They can use his gank setup to snowball themselves. Some great examples are Kindred, Bel'Veth, Evelynn, Kayn, Rek'Sai, and Kha'Zix. For the most part, the only bad pairings with Ornn honestly are simply the champions that are performing the worst in the jungle overall at that time. The other potential risk pairing with Ornn is for a champion that also relies on setting up for their team to carry. Moving on to the early game. The early game on his Ornn is relatively straightforward. Try to farm up and don't die more than you need to. It's not necessarily about winning matchups, it's generally about having equal footing but using Ornn's unique options to your advantage. You might not have to recall when your opponent might because you can forge a few items and get an extra plate or two before the plates fall, but don't take Ornn's tanky nature too seriously because even in the early game, he has some insane damage numbers that can easily find you a kill and win lane. Mid game as Ornn is arguably the most challenging. Just like any top laner, you're constantly struggling trying to evaluate what is the best use of your time. To add to this, Ornn must think critically about the best items for the future of the game from the start because he has so much versatility. Without the right build, there's going to be some serious problems dealing with some of the strengths of the enemy team. The late game is somewhat of an extension of Ornn's mid game where you must still battle with the same conundrums, but at least you're still more established as a tank and you have a bit more of a buffer on some smaller mistakes in mid game that might have gotten you killed. In the late game, you'll want to keep the side lanes in check and get a nice angle for your call of the Forge God that will tear through the enemy team and set up an impeccable engage for your team to have little chance to fail the impending fight. Overall, Ornn is a top lane champion that will always provide tremendous value to his team regardless of his early game. If he doesn't completely int his lane to a hyper carry top laner like Fiora, Jax, or Riven, any disadvantage that he has developed can be easily rendered null and void with a few good ultimates in the mid game, and once he starts upgrading mythic items in his later levels, it is completely unstoppable. While he can be a little bit boring on the surface, his presence cannot be ignored in any game, and I actually find him very, very fun to play. I hope this guide has helped you out though, and I will see you in the next one. Stay fresh.